Scene script. Have you ever heard of Mrs. Watanabe? Who is she, and why is she so important in the world of finance? Well, hold on to your hats, folks, because it turns out that Mrs. Watanabe isn't actually a person at all. The term Mrs. Watanabe is a colloquial moniker used in the financial world to depict the average Japanese housewife who dabbles in the foreign exchange market. Picture this. While her husband is at work and the kids are at school, Mrs. Watanabe sits down at her computer, a cup of green tea in one hand and a mouse in the other, ready to make her mark on the global financial scene. She's not a high-powered broker or a Wall Street tycoon, but her actions, and those of thousands of other Mrs. Watanabes, can make waves in the financial world. But where did this term come from? It's actually a fascinating story. In Japan, it's quite common for the woman of the house to manage the family finances. This goes back to the post-World War II era when most men worked long hours outside the home, leaving their wives to take care of the household budget. Over time, as Japan's economy prospered, these women found themselves with surplus funds to invest, and with the advent of the internet, they began to trade in the foreign exchange market, right from the comfort of their own homes. And so, the Mrs. Watanabe phenomenon was born. Today, the term is used to describe a significant demographic of traders in Japan who collectively have a substantial impact on the world economy. Their trading decisions can influence exchange rates, move markets, and even shape economic policy. And that's the mystery of Mrs. Watanabe. She's not a single individual, but rather a representation of a group of people who, from their living rooms and kitchens across Japan, hold a significant sway over the global economy. So, Mrs. Watanabe is not a single person but a representation of a group of people who have a significant impact on the world economy. So how did Mrs. Watanabe come into existence? The story begins in the land of the rising sun, Japan, where economic conditions were anything but promising. Picture this, a stagnant economy, low interest rates, and a population looking for ways to grow their savings. Not exactly a rosy picture, right? With the country's economy in a slump for nearly 2 decades, the traditional safe havens for savings, like banks and post offices, were offering interest rates close to zero. Yes, you heard it right, zero. The average Japanese citizen was left with a conundrum: where to park their hard-earned money. Enter Mrs. Watanabe, a metaphorical figure representing the millions of Japanese housewives who manage household finances. With their families' futures at stake, these women were not about to let their savings stagnate. They started looking beyond the traditional, beyond the borders of Japan, for alternative ways to grow their hard-earned money. And they found it in foreign exchange trading, or Forex for short. With a keen eye for detail, a knack for numbers, and an unyielding spirit, these women ventured into the high-risk, high-reward world of Forex. They began trading yen for other currencies, betting on fluctuations in exchange rates to bring in profits. It was a bold move, but one that was necessitated by the dire economic conditions at home. The emergence of Mrs. Watanabe was a testament to the adaptability and resilience of these Japanese housewives. They turned a challenge into an opportunity, a crisis into a stepping stone, proving that necessity truly is the mother of invention. Despite the economic challenges, Mrs. Watanabe found a way to thrive. And in doing so, she not only safeguarded her family's future, but also changed the face of Japan's financial landscape forever. The influence of Mrs. Watanabe is far-reaching. But just how significant is this influence? Let's dive right into it. Mrs. Watanabe is not a single person, but a term used to describe Japanese housewives who participate in the Forex market. These women, collectively known as Mrs. Watanabes, have become a formidable force in global economics. Their trading decisions can, and do, affect currency rates worldwide. Imagine a typical day in the life of Mrs. Watanabe. She wakes up, sends her kids off to school, and then sits down at her computer to check the latest currency exchange rates. She's not just looking for a good deal to send money to her son studying abroad. No, she's looking at the market trends and making calculated decisions that could potentially shift the value of currencies on a global scale. Let's talk examples. Remember the global financial crisis of 2008? That was a time when economies worldwide were under massive strain. And guess who was right there taking advantage of the falling values of currencies? Yes, you guessed it, Mrs. Watanabe. By buying low and selling high, these women were able to make significant profits, even as the rest of the world was in financial turmoil. Fast forward to the European debt crisis of 2010. Once again, Mrs. Watanabe was there, ready to capitalize on the fluctuating values of the euro. Their collective trading power was so significant that it even caught the attention of the Bank of Japan, leading them to intervene in the forex market to prevent the yen from appreciating too much. In essence, Mrs. Watanabe is not just a trader. She's a power player, a mover and shaker in the world of global finance. Her decisions can send ripples through the forex market, influencing the value of currencies and potentially impacting global economic events. So, the next time you hear the name Mrs. Watanabe, remember this: Mrs. Watanabe is not just a trader, she's a global economic force. What does the future hold for Mrs. Watanabe? As we've explored, Mrs. Watanabe is not merely an individual, but a symbol of Japan's retail investors. Her influence on the global market has been considerable, and it's exciting to ponder how she might evolve with the changing tides of the economy and technology. We live in an era of rapid economic change. Traditional markets are being disrupted and new financial landscapes are forming. How will Mrs. Watanabe navigate these changes? One can imagine her adapting in the same way she has to past fluctuations. She may venture into new markets like cryptocurrencies or green energy stocks, leveraging her savvy to capitalize on these emerging opportunities. Advancements in technology are also reshaping the world of finance. With the rise of algorithmic trading and AI-driven investment platforms, Mrs. Watanabe may find herself trading alongside machines. This could mean a shift in her trading habits, as she might need to keep pace with these high-speed algorithms. It's a challenge, but one she is likely up to, given her track record of adaptability. But technology isn't just about algorithms and AI, it's also about making trading more accessible, more democratic. Apps and platforms are breaking down barriers, allowing more people to become their own version of Mrs. Watanabe. This could increase her influence, as her trading strategies and tactics could be adopted by a new generation of retail investors. However, these changes also bring uncertainty. Economic shifts can be unpredictable, and new technologies can be disruptive. Mrs. Watanabe will need to stay flexible and resilient, ready to adapt to whatever the future holds. So, what's next for Mrs. Watanabe? It's hard to say, but we can expect her to continue playing a significant role in the market. Whether she's navigating new financial landscapes or adapting to technological advancements, her influence will undoubtedly be felt. The future of Mrs. Watanabe remains uncertain, but one thing is clear: her influence will continue to shape the world of finance. So, what have we learned about Mrs. Watanabe? In this journey, we've discovered that Mrs. Watanabe isn't just a name. It's a symbol, a representation of an everyday investor in Japan, the kind of person you'd probably pass by on the street without a second glance. Yet, this seemingly ordinary individual has managed to make a significant mark on the financial world. We traced Mrs. Watanabe's origins back to the economic landscape of Japan in the late 90s. As interest rates plummeted, people started looking for alternatives to traditional banking. Enter Mrs. Watanabe, the savvy household investor, who sought to maximize her family's savings beyond the meager returns offered by local banks. The influence of Mrs. Watanabe extends far beyond the shores of Japan. With a keen eye for value and an appetite for risk, Mrs. Watanabe turned to foreign exchange trading. The collective power of these individual investors began to sway currency markets, a testament to the impact of retail investors. But what's next for Mrs. Watanabe? As technology evolves and the world becomes more interconnected, the opportunities for Mrs. Watanabe are expanding. From cryptocurrencies to global stocks, the investment landscape continues to diversify. Mrs. Watanabe isn't just adapting to these changes, she's thriving in them. In sum, Mrs. Watanabe is more than just a face in the crowd. She's a beacon of financial resilience, a testament to the power of the ordinary individual in shaping global economic trends. She's a reminder that financial markets aren't just the playground of big banks and hedge funds. They're a space where anyone with a little know-how and an appetite for risk can make their mark. Mrs. Watanabe, a symbol of resilience and ingenuity, reminds us that anyone can make a difference in the world, even in the most unlikely of circumstances.